Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Kel Revs, the chest of the best, the adventurer's best friend, where you can get everything you want for just your top half off. And tonight, we're talking shop. Specifically about episode 4 of the Magnus Protocol. I'm gonna be honest with you. I noticed something about this episode that actually works a little too well, and I'm kind of sort of wondering if there is a pun behind that. I don't know. I don't know if that's I feel like that's not something Johnny would do for something as specific as this. However, I will say, regardless of whether or not it is intentional, I think it's pure bloody brilliant, but we'll get to that in a hot second. But I hope everyone has been having a fantastic morning, afternoon, evening, whatever the time is in your neck of the woods. Without any further ado, why don't we just go ahead and jump into what happens in this episode. Episode 4 starts off incredibly strong simply by, what's the word I'm looking for? Virtue of the sheer amount of bloody panic that occurs in the beginning. You wouldn't believe it because it starts out pretty calm. Sam working as usual, as he does. It's at that point that Alice stomps on over to him and calls him out for apparently doing a bit of snooping. Alice got a security notification about someone trying to access restricted files, specifically those related to anything in regards to Magnus and Protocol. At which point Alice explodes because she can think of only one person who would want to start digging into anything related to, I don't know, the Magnus Institute. Although quite scary that they should title drop all of a sudden. But it doesn't really mean anything because Sam finds that all he's getting is vague information about quote-unquote the Protocol. Alice tells him that he needs to stop doing that because they work for the government and the government loves its secrets. Apparently, a lot of former employees and older employees used to discuss it at many points in time. It's high-level stuff, as she describes it. And she tells Sam that he needs to seriously knock it off with looking into that kind of stuff, and that the only thing she seems to know in regards to the Magnus Protocol is it has something to do with something called Starkwell, which Sam asks for clarification, and we find out that it's a private military contractor with some sort of connection to what is called in-universe as the San Pedro Square Massacre. Not exactly a good look. Not exactly a good look for whatever that is, and certainly not a good look for whatever the quote-unquote protocol is in regards to how it serves the narrative as a whole. But we don't get any more information at this point in time as Gwen pops in immediately, and they pipe down, they quiet down, they shut up, which leads Gwen to think that they were talking about her, but they just don't really follow up on that, and for all we know, Gwen probably doesn't actually care. It's at this point that Sam finally, and of course that means us, finally get to experience Augustus, the third and final voice used to dictate by Freddy. The others, of course, being Chester and Norris. Now, Augustus is interesting just because we don't have a reference for Augustus. He's voiced by, I believe their name is Tim Fearon. And Tim Fearon doesn't seem to have any sort of he's not credited with voice acting at all in Magnus Archive. So this is a new person. No real indication of who they might be. And this incident that they dictate in and of itself doesn't really give any particular indication. And as of catching up to episode 10, there hasn't been any other incident where Augustus has been dictated since then. So there's really nothing to really go off of, but there have been some guesses that I will get into at the end. But Augustus starts dictating. And what he ends up dictating is a letter marked as taking place the 19th of November in 1831. Contents of the letter are written as a sort of addendum to a will of sorts, with the writer addressing a nephew of sorts. They tell the nephew that they are leaving their prized violin to their nephew, as well as an account as to how he came to possess it in life. The writer apparently was the child of a noble lord, but was born out of wedlock. When he was young, he was summoned to a famous school to perform before the Royal Court Orchestra of the Palatinate. I believe that's how that's pronounced. He was kind of forced to do it on top of the great honor it was, but it pretty much pulled him in, and there was no way he could say no, especially considering the fact that being born out of wedlock, he was never going to enjoy a lot of inheritance from his family as a result. So he goes, but he is accompanied by his violin tutor, one Oliver Bardwell, which is a bit on the nose, Bardwell, but that's besides the point. And the two do not get along. They do not like each other. Bardwell being the type of person to constantly remind the writer that they are born out of wedlock and will not enjoy the benefits of being born to a noble lord for long, especially with the circumstances of their birth. And the writer admits to often fantasizing about his grisly death, whether by accident or even by his own hand. In any case, he was quite happy to leave home for Mannheim, but he was kept company by, the coachman and Bardwell, as mentioned earlier. As the journey continues, however, he finds that Bardwell's refined manner slowly eroded over the course of the journey. At first, seemingly just irritable by the journey's hardships, but gradually he describes it as giving way to a feverish restlessness that was marked by eyes clouded with frantic, almost manic gleam, and apparently would imperceptibly whisper during, moments of quiet. The writer even suspects that Bardwell was listening to faraway music. Then, one evening, while practicing violin during the journey, the writer makes a mistake, a very minor one, apparently. But this causes Bardwell to go completely manic and go off on some incoherent rant before eventually throwing himself out of the carriage, dying from his head cracking upon a stone on the road. The rider and the coachman stop, and unfortunately for the rider, the coachman, already well familiar with the volatile relationship between the two, suspects him to be the cause of death of Bardwell. The writer doesn't go into detail about what happens afterwards, but states that, regardless, he ended up alone and wandering in the woods at night. It's at a certain point in his wandering that he spied a fire in the forest and found a figure there, a gentleman of surprisingly refined countenance, and an Englishman, it seems, somewhere in the heart of Germany, from the sounds of it. The figure offers the writer food and asks how he came to be there, with the writer, for some reason that he himself doesn't quite comprehend, ends up giving a full account of his entire life. The figure offers that a, quote, stroke of luck wasn't much in order, considering the circumstances that he found himself living in. And when the writer agrees, the figure reaches over and opens up a sack of items, miscellaneous items, including an assortment of trinkets, ranging from battered knives, chipped porcelain, fine jewelry, small ivory figures, and even a set of gambler's dice, end quote. Reaching in, the stranger, I feel like calling them the stranger might be, we'll just call them the stranger at this point, offers the writer a incredibly high quality violin. There's no marks on it, no mark of a maker in any way, shape, or form. The only distinguishing feature about the violin, aside from how beautiful it is apparently, is that the fingerboard appears to be marked a deep crimson red. And as the rider runs his fingertips along the strings, he cuts his fingertip. He has nothing to offer the stranger, but the figure instead offers to give the violin as a gift from a, quote, true friend. The figure points the rider in the direction of his destination before putting out the fire and taking off, I suppose. The rider walks, ends up at the Mannheim school as promised. No one seems to talk about his arrival, though, or what had happened to him, and a few days later, he's put before a panel of evaluators to decide his admittance into the school. At first, he's unused to the new violin and plays a bit roughly, getting hints of dismissive derision. Indignant, he recalls that he had done terrible things to reach that hall and could never return home in disgrace, so he plays a more elegant and declarative piece, completely commanding the audience's attention. However, he notes that there is a pain in his left hand, and then he looks and sees that his fingertip has actually been torn while he was playing. Blood dripping along the fingerboard and bits of his skin just sort of hanging off of the string. But he still keeps playing. Just a endless, beautiful, I didn't experience it, but he describes it as crescendos, intertwining diminuendos, a dance of command and submission enacted upon the strings, each note eliciting something deep and primeval. And he notes that in the audience there is both astonishment and terror. But astonishment and terror isn't enough to keep a person from getting into the school, and apparently the performance was so breathtaking that he gets accepted into the school. However, that night he realizes that player and instrument, quote, were not so firmly set with this hungering violin. He was a creature with needs and purpose of its own. The needs, of course, being quite simple, blood and flesh, with the rewards being beautiful music. Seems a bit of a lopsided exchange, but we don't make the rules here. Now, the writer's reputation grew as a phenomenal prodigy of music and violin performance. Never really knows if anyone ever noticed how he bled during his performances, but despite his accomplishments, the rise in his reputation, he was never made a noble. He became famous and would perform for a variety of lords and ladies across, I guess, all of Europe, really. But despite how accomplished he was never able to rise above his station in life. And it was in his bitterness that he realized that the sacrifice of blood didn't need to be his own. And so, in order to continue to feel the accomplishment of his music, he became a violin teacher in the cities, where no one would miss any of the poor, downtrodden, unfortunate students he took on. He claims it's important to feed the violin, no matter what, because one time, he says he played once without paying a price. He wrapped his hands to ensure that his fingers would not bleed on the fingerboard. He was expecting that because he wasn't paying the price, that the violin his performance would be horrible. But instead, it ended up being more beautiful than it ever had been before. Except, when he looked into his audience's eyes, he saw that it had become clouded with the same manic glint that he saw in his violin teacher the night he died. And it's at that point that the audience starts to tear into each other. Just pure, unadulterated violence, and he's unable to stop playing until at some point a candelabra falls over and sets the entire venue on fire. The writer ends the letter lamenting that he couldn't destroy the violin, claiming his will wasn't strong enough, that he found solace in the violin for his unhealed trauma, and he wonders if maybe his nephew will be the one to finally put whatever devil is resting in the violin to rest. But he implores the nephew to feed the violin instead. At that point, we return to the OIAR with Alice, Sam, and Gwen discussing the contents of the incident, making mostly light of it, and Sam wondering how a letter from the 1800s ended up in the system. But it's not something, it gets hand-waved. Not hand-waved, but like lampshaded, with someone probably taking an account and digitizing it and uploading it to some sort of database or of some sorts or library. Doesn't really matter. From then on, Alice and Sam have wrapped up their workload and the two of them take off, with Gwen staying behind to catch up on her backlog. However, it's while she is working on her backlog that she gets some sort of email. And in the email, there is a video or maybe an audio file. Probably the video file. Because Gwen watches and listens as someone begs for their life. And another voice replies that she can't allow that to happen, saying that she's really sorry, essentially, that she has to do this. Even though the former voice says that they could disappear again and that they would never know, the voice, which Gwen recognizes in the video as being Lena, says that she has to do this. That she has no choice. It ends with Gwen saying, "What the hell?" and then cuts it there. And with that, that is how episode 4 of the Magnus Protocol ends. Not a lot to go off of yet at the same time, plenty to try and look at. First of all, Sam. Gotta say, buddy, you're not gonna be... That wild curiosity is going to be his undoing. That's for sure. There's no real way to look at it without considering... I mean, it's obviously that's going to be a flaw that drives him forward. Whether it's going to be a fatal flaw or not remains to be seen, but in all likelihood, we can look forward to him lasting until the end of the series proper. But that curiosity, it hasn't worked out for anyone before. It's not gonna start now. However, it is curious to look at what exactly he has managed to find in his snooping. First off, like we said, we get a title drop with the Magnus Protocol. Of course, we have no idea what the protocol is, if it's something that is, like, going to be enacted later, has been enacted before, or is in the process of being enacted. We don't know. We don't really know. However, clearly there is a lot at play here, and whatever it is, we should keep an eye out for whatever Starkwell does. They say that they are a private military contractor. That could mean what? Private army? Weapons manufacturer? Either way, something connects Starkwell to the San Pedro Square massacre. Now, looking up San Pedro Square, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't find anything. There's no real world equivalent from which I could find in my little brief office downtime research. So if you manage to find anything even remotely close to that could serve as possible inspiration, by all means, feel free to share. But I myself was unable to find something. Instead, I just found a random market in, I think, San Diego, California. Maybe somewhere else. I don't recall. Either way, there wasn't much to go off of from there. Nothing to really use as a jumping point, per se. So instead, we're just gonna have to keep an eye out for Starkwell. However, if they are somehow in connection to the Office of, Incident Assessment and Response, then would that make them the external operations that Lena was discussing, or that Gwen heard Lena discussing, or is this a separate thing? Is that the response department of the OIAR? It's something to consider, right? I don't know if I mentioned this in the first episode, but I believe I mentioned saying, maybe the Magnus Institute served as the response department of the OIAR. As time has gone on, I've gone to really I haven't walked it back per se, but I feel like there hasn't been a flux of evidence coming in to support that hypothesis. Granted, it's not like there's been any evidence to support any real hypothesis just yet, but there's been, if anything, there's been an influx of more things that could possibly be the response section of the OIAR. No real way to know. Not yet, at least. So, yeah, we'll just have to see what happens. We'll have to keep an eye out for Starkwell and see if there is any sort of group or individual enacting possible, large-scale acts of violence within a condensed period of time and space. If Starkwell shows up, I highly doubt we'll miss it, but we'll see what happens. But getting into the incident itself, this is the first incident where we get Augustus to dictate. Again, nothing really seems to stand out. The way Augustus speaks comes off as the sound of a rather tired, aged old man. An aged old Englishman, if you will. He speaks with a rather, not gravelly voice, but definitely, if I were to, throw out an age, a number out there, I would say probably 40s, late 40s, mid 50s. I don't know if that's a real gauge to measure someone's voice or age, whether a voice is a good measurement to gauge someone's age. Never really thought to do so, but they are, for all intents and purposes, the sound of an old man. I have seen some speculation that, unfortunately, I don't have a name to put to the face, to the comment per se, but it sounds like there are folks out there that are wondering if maybe Augustus is the original voice of Jonah Magnus. I won't say why they think that, but then there's no reason to discount it at this point in time, especially considering that, Jonah Magnus was active in the 1800s, if I recall correctly. So, to say that maybe this voice is Jonah Magnus could possibly track, especially considering the one instant we have of him dictating is from the 1800s itself. So there's something there. There's something there to hold it up, I think. It's thin. It's like a thin bit of string holding up a very what could be a very heavy revelation, right? But there's not enough evidence to suggest it, and there's not even enough incidents to really support it as a possibility. Unfortunately, Augustus, even in universe, is not that much of a talker for one of the three talkers. He doesn't show up often, according to Alice, and there's no real indication that historical documents from the 1800s show up often or seldom enough. And it feels like if that were the case, if it were a matter of whether an incident is recorded as occurring pre-World War One or the turn of the century, then I feel like even Alice, even Gwen would kind of sort of like start noticing the pattern at that point. They're both very, intelligent individuals. I feel like maybe they would catch on to something like that. But unfortunately, there's no indication of that. For all we know, there might be a couple of like 1800s entries that show up every now and then, but are just not dictated by anyone. So it could possibly just not really matter, and they never really noticed it for that very reason. But then again, Sam himself apparently gets super surprised at there being an entry. Like 2 weeks into his tenure here at the OIAR. So it could just be a matter of how rare such entries are. And even in archives, such entries from older than, the 1900s, the 1800s tend to not really show up either. So, it's a theory. It's a theory, but it's worth holding on to and keeping in the back pocket just in case. But it feels at this point kind of sort of low priority just by sheer virtue of the fact that we haven't really gotten any more of Augustus ever since. But perhaps it makes you wonder why he was used all of a sudden here for narrative purposes, but we'll see. At least we got to hear him finally. 4 episodes in, but we got to him. And that's all that really matters. But getting into the incident itself. The incident is... well, it's interesting, to say the least. All we really have is that it is a young musician who ends up getting a violin that incites violence, which, gotta say, if that's a pun, I dab at you, sir, because I fully appreciate that, considering I've made the violence pun many a times in my own streams, specifically with an item from the shop, but that's neither here nor there. There's nothing about this incident, at least with regards to its setup, that really stands out. However, looking at the letter, what happens, what occurs, there is a very obvious candidate for what kind of fear is present. And that would be the slaughter. The slaughter, for those of you who are unfamiliar, and I'm pretty sure it hasn't come up at this point in time, is the entity that represents the fear of senseless violence. It represents war. It represents just unreasonable destruction that is of such a grand scale that it kind of sort of bleeds into the other fears. I want to say kind of the most? No. Maybe I'm just not being creative enough. But yes, the most obvious candidate is the slaughter. It's quite obvious, really. Like, the guy plays a violin and it feeds on his blood. And if he doesn't feed it, it causes his audience to start tearing into each other and resorting to violence. The way it's described, apparently, like, a couple starts, like, eating each other's, like, one of them starts stabbing her, like, friends, or, like, eating her fiance's eyes while singing to the sound of the violin. It's all very, like, in your face. There's no way it can't be about the slaughter. And it wouldn't be the first time that the slaughter has been associated with music. For example, episode 7, The Piper, which is the avatar of the slaughter, the titular Piper. The way that episode pans out is that in this world of the archives, right, Wilfred Owen was noted to, like, hawk his ear as if he was listening to far-off music during World War I. And in that world, the war is war is depicted as a man with 3 faces, one to play pipes, one to scream, and another silent only to let blood drift and dirt flow from its mouth. The way that episode is sort of explored is that those who hear the song of the piper are destined to die and never return. Although there are those who can survive the Song of Death, however, they live only so long as the war continues, and that ends up being Owen's case. He lives up until the peace accords are signed, ending World War I in the European theater. Yeah. Quite similar, as you might note, to... Well, not similar. The theme of music is still present in this episode, as it is in episode 7 of Magnus Archives. However, it's different, of course, in the sense that if someone hears the music, then they are destined to die in the war, versus here, they are going to kill people. However, it's not the only time that happens in Archives where music is a theme of the slaughter. It also happens in, I forget which episode, but I remember the name, which is called Grifter's Bone. In that episode, there is an individual looking for a band called Grifter's Bone. And apparently, the only thing anyone ever knows about Grifter's Bone is that when they hear it, they end up falling to violence, essentially. The last everyone that's ever listened to it, and no one ever gets out of listening to it, essentially. They end up killing others who are listening in on the band. The only ones who have ever escaped are those who have stabbed out their ears. Yeah. That would be one of 3 times. The third being the Risen War, which occurs in Magnus Archives, episode 137, Nemesis. In this situation, the ritual attempting to bring about the slaughter into the real world involves, you guessed it, music. Eventually, the music starts to crescendo, leading up to a violence taking place, lots of fighting, murder, and mutilation occurring on board the Nemesis, a ship sailing in the Pacific Ocean at that point in time. So, once again, music appearing within the context of the slaughter. And here it is occurring again, and in the form of the violin, or as I have decided to call it, the violins. A literal instrument of war and violence. Now the question is the violin actually alive? It is just the slightest bit different. It's quite tame, in the sense that the violin requires blood to play. It feels like a classic spooky case of a cursed instrument, a cursed item. It's not the first time that something has appeared in pop culture and media, and it won't be the last neither. But the question is, is it actually why? I don't know. I just find it quite an interesting turn of events. That the violin should instead have a price that will cause it to not enact its violence upon the world and its dark powers. But maybe that's just because maybe every item, every cursed item that exists in the world of Magnus is actually has some sort of price that you could pay and therefore not suffer the horrific consequences of interacting with it. I don't doubt it, but I think that might be why the survivorship of all the other items might be so low, is that people don't survive the first time. But how kind of the violin, right? To enact its price so blatantly and so obviously that you would survive multiple encounters and usages of it. Still, the writer says that they need to keep feeding the violin. And the question I guess I should have is should are they being influenced by the violin? Sure, he gets a little poetic and says that, maybe, the instrument and player are not so set in stone when it comes to this violin, but how much of that is the decisions the writer is explicitly making, and how much of it could be attributed to the violin's actual influence. You know? Like, if you left the violin alone, would it cause people to start fighting amongst each other? Because that's also occurred with a Lightner that occurred in archives, where a certain book leads to an entire village basically turning on themselves. But I don't remember if that was a case of someone reading the book, or if it was just because the book was just left there alone. Normally it is just a matter of reading the book, but, you know, sometimes it's hard to tell. It's not always the case. And another question to be had is, the violin was nowhere near the coach when Bardwell killed himself. It wasn't anywhere near the coach when the writer does whatever they do to the coachman, right? So another question to be had is, like, who and why? Just why? Is it because were they passing through a domain of the slaughter? If so, why wasn't the writer affected by it? Although it seems that from a very youthful point in their lives, the writer was already very, very inclined towards violence in the first place, considering how much he often dreamt of the grisly demise of his teacher, and who knows how many other people, right? Is it the writer's influence, and is that one of the reasons why the violin and the writer get along so well, is because he is just naturally touched by the slaughter? Which leads me to have another question. Would you consider the writer an avatar of the slaughter at this point? I would not say so exactly. I guess you could make that a case. I guess you could make that sort of argument in the sense of just like, hey, this dude just like is spreading like violence, especially when they take on the charge of like being a teacher and teaching the violin to not well-off people, taking on students that are very clearly not in a position to do anything when whatever he does to them, feeds them to the violin. Which has, I guess, sort of like shades of the Desolation instead. So you could make the argument that he's more an avatar of the Desolation than he is of the Slaughter. But the thing is, neither of those things seems to be the case. Not exactly. Okay, so I guess first things first, we could really go on to talk about the Desolation. So the Desolation, if we haven't discussed it before, is the fear of like the loss, is the appearance of sudden pain, right? Sudden violence, sudden loss of potential, of broken dreams, and losing one's home, things like that. It's much more personal and in some ways more insidious when compared to the Slaughter. Clearly, obviously, they have shades that kind of sort of blend into each other, but the Slaughter is typically associated with war, and the Desolation is typically associated with just more personal loss. On the other hand, it also has like aspects of like fire as well. With the Slaughter, again, having more aspects of just like war. It gets into like the weird part of the entities in and of themselves. And sometimes I think even now I'm demonstrating that I'm having a hard time of expressing the exact differences between the two. But regardless, you could make the argument that he kind of sort of starts feeding into the Desolation just by sheer virtue of like taking these young hopefuls that think that they're going to learn the violin and rise up and become famous, but he ends up probably killing them and then probably feeding them to the violin in his own little violin torture chamber somewhere in the city. Who knows? He never doesn't exactly go into detail of how he does it. Doesn't really matter. But it could very well like paint him as an avatar of desolation as well, since he's taking these hopefuls and destroying their dreams wholesale. It would certainly be on brand and a character for the desolation. But again, he doesn't really seem to demonstrate any particular powers as a result of feeding either of these. And in the end, he doesn't really seem to feed the slaughter either. He feeds the violin. The violin itself is a manifestation of the slaughter, for sure. That goes without question. But to call the writer and the player an avatar of the slaughter, it might be a bit of a stretch, because while he probably resorts to violence to, take care of his students, it all just goes to the violin in the end. He doesn't spread war. He doesn't spread violence. He simply performs and feeds the violin, for a time his own blood, for a much longer time, I imagine, other people's blood. So I probably kept doing that till his dying days. That's just speculation on my part, but it's hard to say that the writer is an avatar of the slaughter at this point. There's nothing to really cement that as a possibility. All really seems to come from the violin. So whether this knocks out, right, my hypothesis of whether the Freddy is hunting down avatars, I think it doesn't support my hypothesis, just by sheer virtue of the fact that the writer doesn't seem to be a avatar. He is an aggressor, and he's not a victim. Far from it. He is not a victim of the slaughter. He is, in fact, an agent of it, I guess. But he's not an avatar. At least, I don't think he is. If he were truly, truly an avatar, I don't think he would be parting with the violin. I think he passed peacefully with a haunted conscience, but I don't think he was an avatar. Which means someone else has that violin, and that violin is somewhere amongst, in the world, being played with its price being extolled. Extolled? I don't think that's the word. But that still leaves one more person in the incident that requires examination. And that is the mysterious figure in the woods. The mysterious figure is a much more distinct individual, in the sense that there is definitely something spooky supernatural about that dude specifically. There's just imagine you're out in the woods and you happen to find a well-dressed Englishman in the heart of Germany just sat there with a sack full of miscellaneous items, tending a fire, and then he manages, without really doing anything, to get you to tell him his entire life story. It doesn't exactly paint a good picture now, does it? Especially when you're out in the middle of the woods, having committed some horrific act of violence that you won't even talk about. Like, what? Why exactly are you there, good sir? What is the figure in the woods? Is the figure in the woods responsible for the violence that occurred that night? To the figure, to Bardwell, to the coachman. What happened? Who was playing the music? Was Bardwell actually hearing music? And if he was it this figure's doing? We have no way to guess. We have no way to know. There's no information. There's no evidence to suggest that this person is behind that. But we can, at the very least, try to figure out what their shtick and what their deal is. The figure could be, well, there are options. I suspect that the figure might be an avatar of some sort. I just don't know of what. I could be convinced into thinking that they are an avatar of the eye, you know, if only due to the fact that they managed to literally not rip out information from the writer, but they compel the writer, right? One of the archivist's greatest abilities, and the most important, and the most significant, and the most narratively, it drives the whole narrative behind archives, is that the archivist can have and compel someone to tell them, I guess, a story, per se, right? They can ask a question, and unless the person that they're dealing with is another avatar themselves and knows what is happening to them, then they have to answer. No questions asked, nothing to stop them, and it ends up being concise, understandable, and completely coherent. So the mere fact that this mysterious figure manages to get the writer to tell their entire life story, and the writer themselves acknowledges that they don't understand why they told them their entire life story. Who knows? Maybe it could be stress. Maybe it could be the mere fact that, oh, I've been living my entire life and now I'm out here in the middle of these stupid woods and all I can speak is broken Dutch in Germany of all places. Like, that's gonna help me. Like, it could be stress. You could easily write it off as the poor, not child, but like, I don't know, young adult, not tweens age, but like teens age, who knows? He never says how old he is. But it could just be a case of just a psychotic breakdown after whatever horrific, terrific incident that occurs that leaves him fully and completely alone in the middle of Germany. But this is the Magnus Protocol. This is the world of the Magnus Archives, or at least parallel to it. It could very easily be both possibilities. Again, it's early. Unless this figure appears again, we'll never be sure. But I don't know if we will. There's nothing to really indicate that they are an avatar. I guess the second bit of evidence that could suggest a connection to the eye is the fact that the dude, well-dressed and refined in countenance. Maybe he's not well-dressed. Maybe he's just refined in, like, his facial appearances, and that's it. It could, it's the 1800s. It's Victorian age, and in the Victorian age, one's appearance usually is a symbol of intelligence and a symbol of elegance and dignity and all that pseudo-sciencey stuff. It's totally on brand for the Victorian age for them to think that physical appearance is an indication of higher breeding, if you will. But the dude just randomly points into a direction, says, your destination is in that direction, like he's some sort of GPS in 1800s Germany. He's just like, it'll take you a couple hours to go that way. Just go that way and you'll end up at Mannheim School. Alright, that's where you want to go. Go there, and I hope you have a good one. Kind of sort of like Eye a little bit. Just a little bit of Eye of the Beholding to just know where to go. But at the same time, you know, like, in order for that to happen, there needs to be something more to that. Certainly, right? Like, the Eye typically searches out, you know, more traces of the others, right? Fear and like knowledge, but then again, that doesn't really mean anything in this situation, you know? There have been plenty of Eye avatars that simply just know things that have nothing to do with the fears, or just serves their purpose, however just like mundane it might be, like knowing that there's a cake to celebrate the birthday of the archivist, for example, or whatever someone wished for, things like that, for their birthday. You know, it's little things like that, but it lends credence to the idea that it is an avatar of the Eye. Or at least, if nothing else, a servant of the Eye. There's also the matter of collecting items, and just having a collection of items. It brings to mind Salesa, right? Salesa, in Magnus Archives, was an individual who prided himself on collecting artifacts touched and cursed by the entities and selling them to high buyers, one of which, of course, being, for example, the Magnus Archives. Now, the dude himself never actually strays and becomes an avatar of any of the entities. He takes great pains to do that, but he was a collector of the curious, the occult, and the cursed, and he was the type of person to give that away as well. I don't recall him ever giving anything away for free. No, he gave one thing away for free, and he learned to regret it. I do recall that happening at one point in time. I believe that was the meat grinder, which you use your imagination if you haven't caught up to that point in the series. So maybe the figure is just a completely mundane collector of the occult and the weird, but I don't know, man. It doesn't. If that were a wealthy individual trying to, like, make their way in the world by selling cursed items to the wealthy and noble, camping out in the middle of Germany in the forest doesn't seem like the way to go. And again, there's the matter of them just sort of knowing stuff. So and getting someone to tell something. But again, hard to say. It would also kind of sort of be in line with the Eye as well. To just have these items and then to just give them away. Because the Eye also manifests as an intense curiosity of seeing what the hell is going to happen if you do something. It would totally be on brand and in character for an avatar of the Eye to give away a cursed item for free to a random child out in the middle of the woods just because they want to see what will happen. Again, there's nothing to really give us an indication of what is going on here. Actually, come to think of it, I have to wonder about something. If I recall correctly, in Magnus Archives, Jonah Magnus does in fact have a friend out in Germany who did have, like, a home out in the middle of the woods, as well as a tomb out in the middle of the woods, and a graveyard in the middle of the woods that was apparently filled to the brim with cursed books. And the Magnus Archive and the Institute did collect cursed items for its research purposes and artifact storage. Perhaps, and like I said, Jonah Magnus was an Englishman. What if Jonah Magnus connects himself to the Eye again, or rather, on brand and in character, connects to the Eye in this world as well, and that was him? Like, what if that was him? What if his drive for curiosity and knowledge compelled him to go to this specific spot at this specific time and gift this specific item to this specific person just to see what happens? And then immediately, once that his business is concluded, he kicks dirt onto the coals of the fire and takes off. Almost as if he knew he was supposed to be there, and all he knew was that he needed to be there. I mean, there could easily be some aspect of the web drawing him towards this area, but it would also kind of sort of be, if Augustus is the voice of Jonah Magnus, it would also kind of sort of be on brand and character for Magnus to in his self-righteousness, latch on to an incident that features himself. Huh. I hadn't considered this as a possibility. Well now. Now I have something that I should keep an eye out for. Ooh. Now I have something else I should keep an eye out for. I guess from here on out, the best thing we can do with regards to the mysterious figure in the woods is ask ourselves and pay attention to any incident, especially ones that come from the 1800s or are dictated by Augustus, or feature a figure that is collecting items and then giving them away. We'll have to keep an eye out for that and see if maybe there is a pattern of behavior that we can latch onto. Because if indeed this is Jonah Magnus, it could be... well, I have no idea what it could mean, but... well, at least we'll know that the Institute has its same not so... I don't know how to describe it. I don't know how to describe how I'm feeling. All I know is that this situation is getting complicated. I mean, it was already complicated, but we're only just beginning to start seeing how complicated it really is, aren't we? I'm excited. I'm excited. I don't know if this changes any of my analyses for the following episodes that come after this, but I guess I'll just have to review my notes later. And you can look forward to that. We will, of course, be talking about, the Magnus Protocol again on, not tomorrow, but Saturday. Yes, Saturday. I am I am considering possibly covering 2 episodes at a time from here on out, but I feel like it's nice to just sort of have this moment of quiet realization, be like, wait a second, hold on, maybe it's no way to know, no way to tell, but this is fun for me. This is exciting, and I can't wait to see Augustus appear once more before us. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen for another couple of episodes, because unfortunately, Augustus just doesn't appear even up to episode 10. It's just this instance in this case. From here on out, it's just going to be more cases that happen within the 21st century, I believe. Nothing really seems to occur before then, from what I can tell. No, there's one incident, I think, between now and episode 10 that occurs before the 21st century. But even then, it's only by a year or so. So we'll have to see, and we'll have to wait patiently. For now, as before, we're gonna have to put anything that we glean from this incident specifically into our back pocket, just sort of shunt it over to the side, but keep an eye on it for sure. Because there is something there, and whatever it is, I'm fairly certain it will rear its ugly head once more for us to bear witness to. But for now, it's off to the side, and instead we should just try to keep an eye out for Starkwell, and any other mention of the Magnus Institute, and or quote-unquote the Protocol. And of course, there is the matter of Lena, right? The last and final piece of this episode is Gwen getting the video about Lena, it seems, in the process of killing someone. Now, who she's killing, not really, can't really tell. No way to know, no name is mentioned. We can only hope that eventually we'll get information on that as time progresses. It seems, regardless, sorry, I yawned just now. It seems, regardless, they might be someone connected to the government or former connection to the Office of Incident Assessment and Reports. They refer not to Lena as who they need to hide from and that they can disappear and hide away from again. Instead, they refer to vaguely to quote unquote they. playing the pronoun game in this situation. And then presumably Lena kills them. Of course, that just raises one major question. Other than, who is she killing and why? But another question to ask is, why is Gwen getting this video? Why is Gwen getting this video depicting Lena? Like, specifically, why is Gwen getting this video? Why did Alice specifically get the security alert of Sam snooping around? Why didn't that go to, say, someone in IT, like Colin, or anyone else up in upper management? Why hasn't Lena approached Sam about this? Why did the security alert go to Alice? Why did the video go to Gwen? We don't know yet. But it is totally on brand and in character for the web to be behind a little bit of the manipulation of events. Time will tell what the consequences will be of this situation. Only thing that can be said is that whoever is watching them, whoever is watching them, whoever and whatever is manipulating events this time around, odds are they know exactly what they're doing, and they're probably having a fantastic time moving things along their agenda. What that agenda entails, I guess we're just gonna have to wait and see. But with that brings our analysis of episode 4 to a close. Tomorrow, I am afraid we will not be able to do anything, unfortunately, not even the creative workshop, because I will be out for a work party, so the next episode of Talking Shop will take place on Saturday, hopefully, assuming everything goes to plan. And of course, we will continue with these episodes next week, at which point we should be fully caught up with the series, and finally the hiatus will end for Protocol. Episode 11 should drop sometime next week, and then we can turn this into a weekly series proper. But until then, I'll see you guys when I see you. With that, shop's closed. Get out. Bye, guys.